Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How would you design a solution for a mobile app that displays ticket barcodes, ensuring low latency while hosting the database in multiple AWS regions?
I would host the database on Amazon DynamoDB Global Tables and create an Amazon CloudFront distribution. This distribution would be associated with a CloudFront function that contains the back-end logic to validate the barcodes. Finally, I would create an Amazon Route 53 record to map API-example.com to the CloudFront distribution.
What solution would you recommend to enhance the security of a REST API running on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer?
I would recommend creating an AWS WAF Web ACL rule with an IP match condition for the CloudFront service IP address ranges and associating that Web ACL with the ALB. Additionally, I would move the ALB into the 3 private subnets.
How would you design a highly available solution for storing critical data across multiple AWS regions while ensuring security and cost-effectiveness?
I would establish 2 AWS Direct Connect connections from the company headquarters to an AWS region. Then, I would use the company WAN to send traffic over a Direct Connect connection and utilize Direct Connect Gateway to access data in other AWS regions.
How would you ensure a company's application can temporarily run on AWS during a disaster recovery event?
I would configure AWS Elastic Disaster Recovery to replicate the data to Amazon EC2 instances attached to Amazon Elastic Block Store volumes. If the on-premises environment becomes unavailable, I would use Elastic Disaster Recovery to launch the EC2 instances with the replicated volumes.
What solution would you recommend to reduce the lag time for data arriving from new regions to an S3 bucket?
I would create an S3 bucket in each of the new regions and configure the application to upload to those buckets. Then I would set up S3 cross-region replication to transfer the data to the S3 bucket in EU North 1.
How would you provide network connectivity from client applications in multiple business unit VPCs to a centralized application hosted in a shared VPC?
I would create an AWS Transit Gateway. Then I would attach the shared VPC and the authorized business unit VPCs to the Transit Gateway, create a single Transit Gateway route table, and associate it with all attached VPCs. Finally, I would allow automatic route propagation and configure the VPC routing tables to send traffic to the Transit Gateway.
What would be your approach to migrate a microservices website from an on-premises Kubernetes cluster to AWS?
I would recommend rebuilding the Kubernetes cluster on Amazon EC2 instances, migrating the open-source container image repository to those instances, and then deploying the existing manifests to the new cluster on AWS. I would also deploy an open-source PostgreSQL database in the new environment.
How would you redesign the architecture for a mobile app that runs online contests on AWS to reduce costs?
I would add an Amazon Elasticache for Redis cluster in front of the RDS instances to cache contest entries. I'd rewrite the code to run as Amazon Elastic Container Service containers using the Fargate launch type. Additionally, I'd set the Elasticache TTL attribute on each entry to expire at the end of the contest.
What would you do to resolve the issue of traffic not being properly forwarded to the internet from Amazon EC2 instances running proxy software?
I would disable source and destination checks on the EC2 instances that run the proxy software.
What is the best way for a company to manage its manually created VPC in AWS automatically with the least effort?
The company should create a new CloudFormation template that provisions the VPC and use the AWS Serverless Application Model CLI to import it.
How would you provide improved download performance for a new video game release that is expected to be downloaded worldwide?
I would configure Amazon Route 53 and an Amazon S3 bucket for website hosting. Then I would upload the game files to the S3 bucket and use Amazon CloudFront to enhance the download performance.
What migration strategy would you recommend for moving an Amazon Aurora MySQL DB cluster to a new AWS account while minimizing service interruption?
I would recommend taking a snapshot of the existing Aurora database and sharing it with the new AWS account to create an Aurora DB cluster from that snapshot. Additionally, I would create an Aurora DB cluster in the new account and use AWS Application Migration Service to migrate the data.
How would you develop a solution for a company with multiple lines of business that require a single AWS invoice while breaking out costs for each LOB?
I would use AWS organizations to create a single organization in the parent account and invite each LOB's AWS account to join. Additionally, I would create a service control policy that allows only approved services and features, applying that policy to the LOB accounts.
What solution would you recommend for a flood monitoring agency that needs to optimize operational overhead and costs while managing sensor data?
I would recommend sending the sensor data to an Amazon managed service for Apache Flink application to convert it to Apache Parquet format and store it in an Amazon S3 bucket. The data analysts can then query the data using Amazon Athena.
What changes would you recommend to improve the monitoring capabilities and address the issues caused by high load in the database tier of a public retail web application?
I would recommend configuring RED replicas for Amazon RDS MySQL to use a single reader endpoint in the web application, which would help reduce the load on the backend database. Additionally, I would change the target group health check to point at a simple HTML page instead of the product catalog page and set up an Amazon Route 53 health check against the product page to ensure full application functionality. CloudWatch alarms should also be configured to notify administrators if the site fails.
What solution would you recommend for managing Kubernetes in a situation where the control plane and data plane for production workloads must remain on premises?
I would recommend installing Amazon EKS Anywhere on the company's hardware in the on-premises data center and deploying the production workloads on an EKS Anywhere cluster.
How can a company with multiple AWS accounts provide connectivity to an Amazon Aurora DB cluster with minimal operational overhead?
The best approach is to create an AWS Resource Access Manager resource share for the DB cluster and share it with all the development accounts.
How would you automate the identification of unused resources in AWS and notify the operations team of cost increases?
I would turn on billing alerts and use AWS Cost Explorer to analyze costs for the past month. Then, I would create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for total estimated charges, setting a threshold higher than the costs identified. This way, if the threshold is breached, the operations team would receive a notification.
What storage solution would you recommend for a web-based application with peak operations, requiring significant read throughput and a need for disaster recovery?
I would recommend deploying an Amazon FSx for Lustre file system. It can be configured in bursting throughput mode, and you can use AWS Backup to back up the file system to the disaster recovery region.
How would you collect data from sensors in a remote location without internet connectivity and move it to AWS?
I would order an AWS snow cone device with an Amazon Linux 2 AMI, connect it to the local network, and launch an Amazon EC2 instance on the device. Then I would install and configure an FTP server on the EC2 instance and set up the sensors to upload their data to it. After the experiment, I would return the device to AWS to load the data into Amazon S3.
How can a company using AWS organizations share cost and usage report data with multiple business units while minimizing operational complexity?
The company can use AWS Resource Access Manager to share the cost and usage report data from the management account with each member account.
How would you ensure high availability, fault tolerance, and security for a manufacturing application in AWS that is connected to an on-premises data center?
I would add a static AWS site-to-site VPN as a secondary path to secure data in transit and provide resilience for the direct connect connection.
How would you modernize an application that needs to store user-uploaded video files while ensuring performance is not affected?
I would migrate the database to Amazon DynamoDB using AWS Database Migration Service with the AWS Schema Conversion tool. Then I would store the videos as objects in Amazon S3 and keep the S3 key in the corresponding DynamoDB item.
How can a company ensure that deleted documents in Amazon EFS can be recovered within an RPO of 100 minutes?
The solution is to create a new backup plan, update the KMS key policy to allow the AWS as Service role for backup IAM role to use the key, and implement a custom cron expression to run backups every 30 minutes.
What is a secure method for cloud engineers to use the AWS CLI for uploading objects to an Amazon S3 bucket while ensuring they use MFA?
I would attach a policy to the S3 access group that denies all S3 actions unless MFA is present. Then I would request temporary credentials from AWS Security Token Service and use those credentials in a profile that Amazon S3 will reference for actions.
What solution would you recommend for migrating 60 on-premises legacy applications based on the Net framework to AWS without changing the application code?
I would recommend using the Windows Web Application Migration Assistant to migrate the applications to AWS Elastic Beanstalk, and then use Elastic Beanstalk to deploy and manage them.
What is the most cost-effective solution for running large batch processing jobs on data stored in an Amazon S3 bucket?
The most cost-effective solution is to create an AWS batch compute environment using Amazon EC2 Spot instances with the Spot capacity optimized allocation strategy.
What solution would you recommend for archiving image data from an on-premises application to AWS? considering cost-effectiveness and retrieval needs.
I would deploy an AWS Data Sync agent on a general-purpose Amazon EC2 instance. The agent would copy the batch of files from the on-premises NFS server to Amazon S3 standard. After the copy, I would delete the data from on-premises storage and create an S3 lifecycle rule to transition those objects to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 1 day.
How can a company track unique users for its application with minimal changes to the existing setup?
The company can configure an Amazon CloudWatch logs metric filter to save each successful login as a metric, using the username and client name as dimensions.
How would you replace long-lived secret keys in a GitHub Action CI/CD pipeline that accesses AWS resources?
I would create an IAM OpenID Connect identity provider in AWS IAM. Then, I would create a new IAM role with a trust policy that allows the assume role with Web Identity API call from the GitHub OIDC provider and update GitHub to assume that role.
How would you optimize the architecture of a web crawling process that currently uses Amazon EC2 instances and an SQS queue?
I would convert the web crawling process into an AWS Lambda function to pull URLs from the SQS queue and modify it to store results in Amazon S3.
What solution would you recommend for migrating a website with a CMS and MySQL database to AWS while ensuring scalability and no changes are required?
I would recommend creating an Amazon Elastic file system for persistent storage, then using a launch template and an auto-scaling group for the EC2 instances to support the CMS. A network load balancer would help distribute traffic, and I would create an Amazon Aurora MySQL database. Additionally, I would use an EC2 auto-scaling scale in Lifecycle Hook to mount the EFS file system to the EC2 instances.
How would you implement disaster recovery for a critical application hosted in a single AWS region?
I would launch additional EC2 instances in a separate region and add them to the existing load balancer. Then, I would create a read replica of the RDS database in that region and instruct the finance team to run their queries against the read replica. I would also set up S3 cross-region replication to copy data to a new S3 bucket in the separate region. In the event of a disaster, I would promote the read replica to a standalone DB instance and configure the application to point to the new S3 bucket and the promoted read replica.
How would you make a company's services available to other companies using AWS while ensuring the data remains secure and does not traverse the internet?
I would create a VPC endpoint service that accepts TCP traffic hosted behind a network load balancer and make the service available over Direct Connect.
How would you ensure that only administrator roles can perform IAM actions across multiple AWS accounts?
I would set an IAM permissions boundary that allows IAM actions and attach it to every administrator role across all the AWS accounts.
How can a development account access applications in a shared services account using a transit gateway?
The best approach is to enable automatic acceptance for the transit gateway in the shared services account. Then use AWS Resource Access Manager to share the transit gateway with the development account. After accepting the resource in the development account, a transit gateway attachment can be created there.
How would you generate a total cost of ownership report for migrating virtual Microsoft workloads to AWS given the constraints?
I would use the AWS Application Migration Service Agentless Service along with the AWS Migration Hub Strategy recommendations to generate the TCO report.
How would you ensure that game assets are fetched from the closest AWS region and have a fallback option if they become unavailable?
I would create an Amazon Route 53 health check for each application load balancer and then set up a latency alias record pointing to both ALBs, ensuring the Evaluate Target Health option is set to Yes.
How would you improve the performance of VPC flow log analysis in a scenario where logs are stored in a centralized S3 bucket?
I would update the VPC flow log configuration to store the logs in Apache Parquet format and specify hourly partitions for better performance.
What steps would you take to establish a dedicated connection between on-premises infrastructure and AWS using a Direct Connect connection?
I would advertise the on-premises network prefixes over the transit VIF and also advertise the VPC prefixes from the Direct Connect gateway to the on-premises network over the transit VIF.
How would you ensure that access to applications in Amazon Workspaces is restricted to branch office locations?
I would use AWS Firewall Manager to create a web ACL rule with an IP set that includes the public addresses of the branch offices and then associate that web ACL with the Workspaces directory.
How would you modernize the deployment of firewall appliances in a centralized networking account on AWS?
I would recommend deploying a gateway load balancer and setting up an endpoint service using AWS Private Link. Additionally, I would create an auto-scaling group with a launch template that uses the new script for configuration and set up VPC endpoints in the centralized networking account while updating the route tables in each member account.
What steps would you take to implement a multi-region architecture for an Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL database?
I would create a cross-region read replica of the database in the secondary region and configure an AWS Lambda function there to promote the read replica during a failover event. Additionally, I would create a failover routing policy in Route 53 for the database DNS record, setting the primary and secondary endpoints to the respective endpoints in each region.
What would you recommend to optimize the performance of an application experiencing high API calls during a flash sale on AWS?
I would add an Amazon ElastiCache for Redis cluster to store frequently accessed data from the RDS database.
How would you redesign a retail company's application architecture into an event-driven solution using serverless services?
I would migrate the applications as microservices to Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service Containers using AWS Fargate. The retail MySQL database would be moved to Amazon Aurora Serverless MySQL, and the analytics database would be migrated to Amazon Redshift Serverless. I would use Amazon Event Bridge to send all incoming data to the microservices and the analytics database.
How would you enable AWS CloudTrail across multiple AWS accounts in an organization efficiently?
I would create a new CloudTrail trail in the organization's management account and configure it to log all events for all AWS accounts in the organization.
How would you ensure secure access to a VPC for remote engineers while adhering to the company's security policy?
I would create an AWS client VPN endpoint and an AD connector directory for integration with Active Directory domain services. Then, I would enable multi-factor authentication for the AD connector and use AWS Client VPN to establish the VPN connection.
What steps would you take to migrate a 3-tier web application to AWS to improve scalability and reduce operational effort?
I would refactor the front end to host static assets on Amazon S3 and use Amazon CloudFront to serve it. Then, I would refactor the Java application into a Docker container and host it on AWS Fargate. Finally, I would use AWS Database Migration Service to replatform the PostgreSQL database to Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL and enable Aurora autoscaling for read replicas.
How can a company ensure continuous scanning for security vulnerabilities in an application deployed on AWS with EKS and ECR?
The company can activate Amazon Inspector to scan both the EKS nodes and the ECR repository.
How can a company improve the reliability of its ticketing application during high load periods?
The best solution would be to create a separate service in the ECS cluster for the waiting room and use a different scaling configuration. Additionally, a CloudFront function can be created to inspect the JWT information and forward requests to either the ticketing service or the waiting room service.
How would you resolve the issue of an EC2 instance in a child account being unable to assume a role in a parent account after recreating the role in a CloudFormation template?
I would edit the trust policy for the role in the parent account to add a statement that allows the STX assume role action for the root principal of the child account.
How would you improve the reliability of a web application that is experiencing issues due to high load?
I would create an Amazon CloudFront distribution with the EC2 instance as the origin. Additionally, I would configure a multi-AZ deployment for the RDS for MySQL database and utilize the standby DB instance for read-intensive operations.
How would you set up an AWS Transfer Family SFTP server to automatically decrypt PGP encrypted data received from a third-party supplier?
I would store the PGP public key in Secrets Manager, add an exception handling step in the Transfer Family managed workflow to decrypt the files, configure the PGP decryption parameters in the exception handler, and associate the workflow with the SFTP user.
How can a company allocate its cloud costs to different business units in AWS and visualize those costs?
The best solution is to create a cost allocation tag named Business Unit in the organization's management account. Then, in each member account, set up an Amazon S3 bucket and an AWS cost and usage report. Each S3 bucket should be configured as the destination for its respective AWS CUR. Finally, create an Amazon CloudWatch dashboard in the management account for visualization.
What changes would you recommend to address the performance issues with Lambda functions and DynamoDB in this scenario?
I would suggest increasing the write capacity units for the DynamoDB table and increasing the memory available to the Lambda functions.
How would you configure high availability for Amazon workspaces across 2 AWS regions?
I would create a connection alias in the primary region and associate it with a directory in the failover region. Then I would set up a Route 53 failover routing policy and ensure Evaluate Target Health is set to Yes.
What solution would you recommend for a company planning to migrate many VMs to AWS, considering they need an initial assessment and visualization of application dependencies?
I would recommend installing the AWS Application Discovery Agent on each on-premises VM. After the data collection period, they can use AWS Migration Hub to view the application dependencies and download the Quick Insights Assessment Report.
How would you increase the security for APIs hosted on AWS to prevent denial of service attacks and guard against vulnerabilities?
I would use AWS WF to protect the API Gateway API. Configure Amazon Inspector to analyze the legacy API and set up Amazon Guard Duty to monitor for any malicious attempts to access the APIs.
How would you address poor API performance and database connection failures in a serverless e-commerce application during a traffic surge?
I would create an RDS proxy endpoint for the database, store database secrets in AWS Secrets Manager, set up the necessary IAM permissions, and update the Lambda functions to connect to the RDS proxy endpoint. Additionally, I would increase the provisioned concurrency for the Lambda functions.
What steps should a solutions architect take if internal applications cannot connect to interface endpoints due to public IP resolution?
The solutions architect should enable the private DNS option on the VPC attributes.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.